So, The Wolves of Willoughby Chase. We've got 2 chapters to go. This seems to be taking forever because the Scottish Government allowed these children back to school and I'm sitting at home bored because I've got no project to work on. But it won't be long before these 2 children come back home again permanently because the cases of COVID are rising. What? Sorry, I'll start again. This is Joan Aitken. Anyway, chapter 10. Yeah, they want to see the film of the book, which isn't actually as good as the book. But anyway. Chapter 10. All 3 children retreated onto the landing once more. It seemed dreadful to stay in the little close room and talk about Aunt Jane with her quite unconscious of their presence. Sylvia noticed that the window was shut, the dishes unwashed. A thick layer of dust covered everything. "What do you think is the matter with her?" Sylvia said, her voice quavering. "I don't know," said Bonnie decidedly. "Whatever it is, we must get a doctor to her at once." "Yes, Bonnie, how sensible of you, but where shall we find one?" "Has Aunt Jane no regular doctor?" "She always said she could not afford one," said Sylvia, dissolving into tears. "She always said her ailments could not be cured by Parkinson's penny pink pills." "Now come, Sylvia, don't get into those crying ways again," Bonnie began, sounding cross because she was so worried, when Simon interposed. "I think I saw a doctor's plate on the floor below. Wait a moment, I'll go down and make certain." He pushed past the geese, who were roosting on the stairs, and ran down to the landing below. Sure enough, by the door out of which the head had popped was a notice: "Gabriel Field, physician and chirurgeon," which is actually where we get the modern word surgeon from. Simon knocked. Excuse me. I think I've got something stuck in my throat. A voice shouted, "Come in, it's not locked," and so he pushed open the door and looked in a room which was in a considerable degree of confusion. Several shelves along the walls bore clutter of bottles, files, and surgical implements. A large table was covered with brushes, jars, and tubes of paint, while the floor was almost equally littered with stacks of canvases and piles of medical books. The young man who had looked out before stood with a paintbrush in his hand, considering a half-finished painting on a large easel. "Oh, it's you! Oh, it's you again, is it?" he said, seeing Simon's perplexed face come round the door. "What do you want?" Sorry. Simon found something reassuring in his rather brusque manner. "Please, are you Dr. Field, sir?" "Yes, I am. The old lady upstairs is very ill. Could you come and look at her?" "Certainly, just a moment, while I wash my hands." While Dr. Field was washing and fetching a black bag of medicines from his bedroom, Simon stared at the picture on the easel. "Like it?" said the doctor, coming back. "Yes," said Simon, "I do very much, but I'm not sure about the bottom right-hand corner. It seems a bit too dark." The doctor gave him a surprised look before waving him out of the door and hurrying upstairs. He brushed past the 2 girls and the geese without comment and made his way into Aunt Jane's bedroom. One of you 2 girls come and help me," he said. So Sylvia went, while the other 2 remained on the landing in a silence of anxiety and suspense. They had to wait some time while Dr. Field made a thorough examination of Aunt Jane. Then he and Sylvia came out onto the landing. "She's your aunt, is she?" Thank you, Rachel. "She's your aunt, is she?" he said sharply. "Well, you've been neglecting her. She's suffering from malnutrition." As none of them appeared to understand this word, he added impatiently, "Undernourishment. She's been starving herself." Sylvia began to cry quietly. "Oh, poor Aunt Jane. I should never have left her." "I'm to blame too," said the doctor angrily. "I saw her coming upstairs a couple of weeks ago with her shopping, 1 egg and an apple. I should have guessed. What does she need, sir? Said Simon quietly. I'll go out and get it. Firstly, champagne. She's too weak to take anything else at the moment. That's ridiculous. You won't give anybody champagne. You needn't bother about that. I have a bottle in my room. Then beef, tea, eggs, milk, butter, honey. Yeah. We'll go and get them, said Bonnie. Come on, Simon. I saw a basket in Aunt Jane's parlour. Sylvia and you stay with the doctor and see to the champagne. Can you direct us to the nearest market, sir? We have only just come to London and don't know our way about. Dr. Field told them how to get to the nearest market, and they ran off with their basket, while Sylvia helped administer a few teaspoonfuls of champagne to Aunt Jane.
Why was she starving herself?
I don't know. Maybe she's worried and weak.
Poor.
Tipping it between her motionless lips. You're the old lady's niece, aren't you? Said the doctor. I've only been in this house a month. I thought she had no kin at all. It's high time she was properly looked after. Sylvia considered the doctor. He had a kind, sensible face, and she was inclined to confide the whole story to him and ask his advice, but thought she'd better wait till the others returned. Simon and Bonnie soon came back. They were loaded, for, as well as the food, Simon was carrying a small sack of coal, and Bonnie had a blanket and a fleece shawl. While they were out, they had a short, brisk argument. Simon, this is your money we're spending. Your year's money. We shouldn't be doing it. Oh, fiddlesticks, he said uncomfortably. Anybody would do all they could to help that poor old lady. Well, I shall pay you back as soon as I possibly can, Simon, if I ever get my own home and money back, but otherwise you do understand you'll have to wait till I can earn some money, and gracious knows how many months that'll be. Oh, get along with you, girl. You're wasting time, said Simon good-naturedly. Dr. Field suggested that they should do their cooking downstairs in his room in order not to disturb the invalid. So Bonnie...
What's the invalid?
Well, somebody who's infirm and not able to walk and move themselves. So Bonnie, first, it's an old expression as well for a disabled person. So Bonnie, first borrowing Aunt Jane's cookery book, set about scraping some beef and putting it into the simmer with carrots and a teaspoonful of brandy. Simon lit a fire in Aunt Jane's room, and Sylvia tiptoed about cleaning the place and setting it to rights. Every now and then Dr. Field came and administered another teaspoonful of champagne, and presently he reported with satisfaction an improvement into the patient's breathing and a tinge of colour in her cheeks. Your cousin's cooked you a meal, he said to Sylvia and Simon after a while. Better come down and eat it in my room. They realised they had not eaten all day, and they were glad to come down. Bonnie had cooked a great panful of bacon and eggs, which he cordially invited the doctor to share. Are you all cousins? Said he, when they were eating, among the paints and bottles of medicine. Oh no, Sylvia and I are, but Simon's no relation. Where are all your parents? They looked at each other and, without the need for discussion, decided that they could trust the doctor. Bonnie told him the whole story, ending with the sight of Mr. Grimshaw at the lawyer's office that morning. And oh, sir, she ended, with tears in her eyes, can you tell me if the ships my parents sailed in truly sank? Truly. What's its name? The Sally. Is that you think you pronounce it? The Sally? Yes, my poor child, he said sadly. I wish I could tell you otherwise, but I read the report in the Times myself. It was said that the captain should never have set sail, knowing the dangerous state of the ship's hull. It was said that someone must have paid him handsomely to do so, and it was rumoured that he himself had escaped in a small boat some hours before the wreck. Bonnie could not speak for a moment. She turned away to the window and bit her lip. Dr. Field went on hastily to break the unhappy silence. The whole business sounds to me like a plot hatched up beforehand between this Miss Slycarp of yours, who evidently is a thorough wrong 'un, and her precious friend Grimshaw and Mrs. Brisket. Whether Gripe the lawyer has a hand in it too, we can't be sure. But I've a friend who's a lawyer, and as soon as old Miss Green is fit to be left, I'll go and see him and ask what he knows about Gripe. Oh, could you, sir? Thank you indeed. Their faces of gratitude evidently touched his heart, for he said gruffly, a couple of you can bed down here if you like. I've plenty of cushions. Just shift some of these books and pictures and the skeleton off the sofa. Sylvia gave a faint scream. She had not noticed the skeleton before. One of you should sleep upstairs with the old lady, and you'd better all get yourselves a wash and a brush up. You look as if you can do with it. I wonder what they did with the geese. The beef tea was ready now, and Sylvia, with the doctor's help.
Tea?
Yeah, the beef tea. Maybe that's just maybe, like, I call tea, you call it dinner, don't you? So it's a tea of beef. It was a beef stew, maybe. With the doctor's help, fed some of it to Aunt Jane through a straw. She opened her eyes once or twice, but seemed hardly conscious of her surroundings yet. With the aid of a couple of the doctor's blankets, Sylvia made herself up a couch for the night by the side of Aunt Jane's bed. They were all tired and went to sleep as soon as they lay down. In the middle of the night, Sylvia awoke. She had left a midnight light burning, and by its faint glimmer she saw that Aunt Jane had raised herself on her pillows and was looking wonderingly about her. Mind, Auntie, said Sylvia, springing up, you'll uncover yourself. Carefully she arranged the woolly shawl around her auntie's shoulders again. It is Sylvia, but no, said Aunt Jane mournfully. I have so often dreamed that she came back. This must just be another dream. No, it isn't, said Sylvia, forgetting to be careful in her joy and giving her aunt an impetuous hug. It really is me. Come back to look after you. I brought Bonnie too. Sylvia, my precious child, Aunt Jane murmured, and 2 tears slipped down her cheeks. Now, Aunt dear, you must get strong quickly. Please try to sip some of this. And Sylvia, who had been hastily heating up the beef tea over the nightlight, Aunt Jane sipped it, and soon, for she was still very weak, she slipped off to sleep, holding Sylvia's hand. Sylvia too began to doze, leaning against her aunt's bed, half awake and half dreaming. She dreamed that she was on top of a mountain, the black ridge that they had crossed before they reached Herondale. She saw Miss Slycarp coming up from Blastburn at the head of a pack of wolves. Sylvia was dumb with fright. She was unable to move. Nearer and nearer Miss Slycarp came. Tramp, tramp, tramp. Suddenly Sylvia was awake and listening, and there were footsteps coming up the stairs. She lay palpitating, with her heart hot against her ribs. Who could it be? The night was still dark. No light showed under the door. It was the doctor. Surely he would be carrying a light. The steps were very slow, very cautious, as if whoever it was wanted to make as little sound as possible. Sylvia knew that she must move. She must. A frantic cackling, hissing and honking broke out on the stairs. There was a yell, a thud, more cackling, pandemonium. Pandemonium? Well, that's like chaos, but I'll get the exact definition for you. Pandemonium. Wild and noisy disorder or confusion, uproar. It comes from Milton's Lost Paradise, from pan plus demon. So it's like it's denoting a place of demons. What is it? Said Aunt Jane drowsily. Oh, what can it be? Cried Sylvia, pale with terror. But the noise had shaken her out of her paralysis, and she seized a candle, lit the nightlight, and ran to the door. The scene that met her eyes when she held the door open was a strange one. At the top of the stairs were 2 indignant geese, still hissing and arching their necks for battle. Prone on the stairs, head down and curiously voluble, was Mr. Grimshaw. Simon held one of his arms and Bonnie the other. Dr. Field, in a dressing gown, looking sleepy and considerably annoyed, was emerging from his front door, holding a piece of rope, with which he proceeded to tie Mr. Grimshaw's hands and ankles. "Breaking into people's houses at 3 in the morning, he muttered. "That's really a bit high. It's bad enough having children and geese camped all over the place." "It was lucky the geese sounded the alarm," said Bonnie, pale but clutching Mr. Grimshaw gamely. "True," Dr. Field agreed. "Now, lock him in the broom closet." "Good. I'll just run down and bolt the outside door, then perhaps we can have a bit more sleep. We'll get to the bottom of this in the morning." Yawning, they all went back to bed. But Sylvia declared she was too scared to sleep without Bonnie, and so they brought up more of the doctor's cushions and made a double pallet beside Aunt Jane's bed. Right, let's get this finished, okay? So we're just going to go straight on with chapter 11. Dr. Field's, and I think this is the final chapter, is it not? Yes, it is, right. Dr. Field's face at breakfast next morning was grim, and the children were all rather silent. The unseen presence of Mr. Grimshaw in the broom cupboard put a dampener on their spirits. "What do you suppose he was trying to do?" whispered Bonnie. "Oh, very likely just to see if you were there," said Dr. Field doubtfully, "or try to frighten the old lady into handing you over if you should turn up later. At all events, you and the geese, between you, put an effective stop to him. I shall take him straight to Bow Street after breakfast and put him in charge of the constables." Luckily, Aunt Jane was a great deal better this morning. After the doctor had inspected her, he pronounced that she might be given a little warm gruel and some tea and dry toast, which Bonnie and Sylvia prepared. Aunt Jane greeted Bonnie kindly and declared that she should never have recognised her, which was very probable. At the last time they had seen Bonnie had been at her christening. Then Sylvia announced that she would remain with the old lady while the rest of the party went off with the prisoner. The very sight of Mr. Grimshaw, she said, made her feel sick with fright. Dr. Field considered this to be a sensible plan, and he told Simon to go out and whistle for a hackney cab. Mr. Grimshaw was released from his closet, but his bonds were not untied. He was sulky, threatening, and lachrymose by turns. In the same breath he begged for mercy and then swore he would get even with them. "That's enough, my man. You can spare your breath," said Dr. Field, and showed him a blunderbuss, ready primed, which he had taken out of his desk drawer. At the sight of this weapon, Mr. Grimshaw relapsed into a cowed silence. "Shall I get my fowling piece?" exclaimed Bonnie, and then remembering that it was with the cart in Hampstead. Dr. Field looked slightly startled, but said he thought one weapon should be sufficient to keep the scoundrel in order. At this moment Simon came back to report that a cab was waiting below, and after a solicitous farewell to Aunt Jane and Sylvia, bidding the latter keep the door locked and admit nobody, they took their departure. At Bow Street they waited only a very few minutes while the doctor hailed his prisoner into the constabulary office. He soon reappeared, accompanied by a couple of burly, sharp-looking individuals who marched Grimshaw between them, and they all piled into the cab again. "Where's he to be taken to now?" said Bonnie. "We shall go to Mr. Gripe's office for some explanation of Grimshaw's behaviour," Dr. Field told her. He said that he worked for Mr. Gripe. They were soon back in the region of Lincoln's Inn Fields and drove up to the house that Bonnie and Sylvia had seen the day before. A scared-looking clerk, hardly more than a boy, admitted them into the waiting room, and next moment a thin, agitated, grey-haired man hurried into the room, exclaiming, "What can I do for you, gentlemen? I am how do you pronounce that? Abednego Gripe. Abednego Gripe. I wish I knew how to pronounce that. Funny name. Anyway, he appeared excessively surprised to see the children and the manacled Mr. Grimshaw. Bonnie soon decided that he could not have hatched a dark plot to obtain possession of Willoughby Chase. He looked too kind and harmless. One of the Bow Street officers spoke up. "I am Sam Cardigan, sir, an officer at the constabulary. Here is my card. Can you identify this person here?" Indicating Mr. Grimshaw. "Why, yes," said Mr. Gripe, looking at Mr. Grimshaw with distaste. "His name is Grimshaw. He was a clerk in my office until he was dismissed for forgery." "Aha!" said the other Bow Street officer, whose name was Spock. Have you ever seen him since you dismissed him? Said Dr. Field. No, indeed. He would have a very cold reception in this office. And yet he was seen entering here yesterday, snapped Cardigan. Mr. Gripe seemed surprised. Not to my knowledge. Cardigan looked thunderously disbelieving and was about to burst out with his suspicions of Mr. Gripe when the little clerk who had let the party in and who had been standing in the doorway with eyes like saucers piped up, Please, sir, I saw him. Mr. Grimshaw darted a furious look at the speaker. Who are you? Said Cardigan. Please, sir, Marmot, a clerk. Yesterday, while Mr. Gripe was out having dinner, that gentleman, as is tied up there, came and asked me to give him the address of Miss Jane Green, sister to Sir Willoughby. And you gave it him? Yes, sir. He said he wished to take her some dividends. Dividends indeed, growled Mr. Field. Wanted to murder her, more probably. Certainly not, said Grimshaw, pale with fright. I merely wish to ascertain from her if these children, who are the runaway wards of a friend of mine, had taken shelter with her. At 3 o'clock in the morning, a fine story. More likely you wanted to terrify her into signing some document giving you power over the children. And what about this Letitia Slycarp, continued Dr. Field, glaring at the lawyer. Were you responsible for sending that female fiend to feather her nest at Willoughby Chase? Mr. Gripe looked very much alarmed. She is a distant relation of Sir Willoughby. She came with the highest references, he began, from the Duchess of Kensington. I have them still. He pulled out a drawer in a cabinet and produced a paper. Cardigan scanned it. A patent forgery, he said at once. I have seen the Duchess's signature on many documents, and it is utterly unlike this. Then I have been duped, cried Mr. Gripe, growing paler still. But what can have been the object of this deceit? Why, said Bonnet indignantly, Miss Slycarp has taken our whole house for her own, dismissed all the servants, sent me and my cousin to live in a school that is no better than a workhouse or prison, and treated us with miserable cruelty. And I believe, too, she and Mr. Grimshaw had some hand in seeing that Papa and Mamma set sail on a ship that was known to be likely to sink. This is a bad business, a very bad business, said Mr. Gripe. No, no, cried Mr. Grimshaw, now nearly dead of terror. We were not responsible for that. The ship was sunk by an unscrupulous owner to obtain the insurance. It was when I learned, through a friend who was a shipping clerk, that they were to sail on the Thessaly, that the plan took shape. I had seen Sir Willoughby's letter to Mr. Gripe, asking him to seek out his cousin Letitia Slycarp as an instructress for his daughter, and so you conspired with Miss Slycarp, and you forged her credentials, said Mr. Gripe angrily. It is all very plain, sir. Take him away, gentlemen. Take him away and keep him fast until he can appear before a magistrate. After that it was very dull, said Bonnet, reporting the scene to Sylvia later. I had to tell the Bow Street officers every single thing I could remember that Miss Slycarp had done, and the clerk wrote it all down, and Mr. Gripe looked more and more shocked, especially when I told what I had seen when we looked through the hole in the secret panel and watched them tearing up Papa's will and all the other documents. And the end of it all is, Sylvia, that Mr. Grimshaw is committed to prison until the assizes, when he will stand his trial for fraud, and the Bow Street officers are to go to Willoughby tomorrow to seize Miss Slycarp. How surprised she will be, exclaimed Sylvia, with lively pleasure. I almost wish I could be there to see. But Sylvia, you are to be there. They most particularly requested that you and I should be taken to act as witnesses. But who will look after Aunt Jane? Inquired Sylvia anxiously. Dr. Field has said that he would procure a nurse for a few days, and it need be for only 2. You can return directly, Miss Slycarp is apprehended. And Sylvia, as soon as Aunt Jane is well enough to travel, I have asked Mr. Gripe to arrange that she shall come and live at Willoughby, and be our guardian." "Oh, yes," exclaimed Sylvia, her face brightening. "What a splendid plan, Bonnie." It was a gay and lively party that assembled in the train next day, very different from the earlier and sorrowful departure when Sylvia had taken leave of Aunt Jane. A special coupe compartment had been chartered, and the Bow Street officers had no objection to Simon and his geese travelling in it as well. Dr. Field was remaining to keep an eye on Aunt Jane, but he bade the children a cordial farewell and invited them to come and sleep in his apartment again when they returned to take Aunt Jane to Willoughby. Mr. Gripe, the lawyer, was with them, and they had given the clerk instructions to procure a luncheon hamper from which came the most savoury smells. Sylvia smiled faintly as she thought of the other tiny food packet and Mr. Grimshaw's sumptuous Jamfield cakes. "I suppose he only pretended to have forgotten who he was when the portmanteau fell on him," she said to Bonnie. "So that he would be taken to Willoughby," said Bonnie, nodding. "How I wish that we had left him in the train. Still, he did save me from the wolves." There were no wolves to be seen on this journey. The packs had all retreated to the bleak north country, and the train ran through smiling pasture lands, all astir with sheep and lambs, or through green and golden woods carpeted with bluebells. The day passed gaily, with songs and storytelling. Even the dry Mr. Gripe proved to know a number of amusing tales, and in between the laughter and chat, Cardigan and Spock, the Bow Street officers, busily wrote down in their notebooks more and more of the dreadful deeds of Miss Slycarp, recounted to them by Bonnie and Sylvia. They reached Willoughby station at dawn. Mr. Gripe had written to one of the inns at Blackburn for a chaise, and it was there to meet them. "How different this road seems," said Sylvia, as they set off at a gallop. "Last time I travelled along it there were wolves and snow, and it was cold and dark. Now I see primroses everywhere, and I am so hot in these clothes I can hardly breathe." They were still wearing the tinker children's clothes Patron had made for them, for there had been no time in London to get any others made. Mr. Gripe's eyes winced when he encountered them, for he liked children to look neat and nicely dressed. "Let us hope that Miss Slycarp had not got rid of all our own clothes," said Bonnie. When they reached the boundary of Willoughby Park, they saw an enormous notice, new since they had left. It said, "Willoughby Chase School, a select seminary for the daughters of gentlemen and the nobility boarders and parlour boarding principals, Miss L. Slycarp and Mrs. Brisky." "What impertinence!" gasped Bonnie. "Can she really have made our home into a school?" "This is worse even than I feared," said Mr. Gripe grimly, and the chaise turned into the gateway. They took the longer and more roundabout road that led to the back of the house, for the Bow Street officers wanted to surprise Miss Slycarp. "Didn't you say that there was a secret passage, miss?" Sam Cardigan said to Bonnie. "Yes, and a priest's hole and an oubliette." "Very good. Couldn't be better. We'll put some ginger in the good lady's gravy." He explained his plan to Mr. Gripe and the children, and they knocked at the back door. It was opened by James. "Miss Bonnie, Miss Sylvia!" he exclaimed, scarlet with joy and surprise. They both flung themselves on him and hugged him. "James, dear James, are you all right? Is Pattern all right? What is going on here? Terrible doings, miss." Now," said Sam Cardigan. "Pleasure at seeing an old acquaintance, all very well. But business is business. We must get under cover. My man, where can this carriage be concealed?" "It can go in the coach house, sir," James told him. "There's only Miss Slycarp's landau now." The carriage was hastily put away, and the conspirators took refuge in the dairy. "Now, James," said Bonnie, dancing with excitement, "you must go and tell Miss Slycarp that Sylvia and I have come back, and that we are very sad and very sorry for having run away. Don't say anything about these gentlemen." "Yes, miss," said James, his eyes beginning to twinkle. "She's teaching just now, up in the schoolroom. The pupils study for an hour before breakfast." "Is the entrance to the secret passage still open, James? Has Miss Slycarp ever discovered it?" No, To the second and yes to the first, Miss Bonny, said James, and pulled aside the cupboard and horse blankets, which he had arranged to conceal the opening. Capital. Go to her quickly then, James. Tell her we are starving. You don't look it, begging your pardon, miss, said James, grinning, and left the room. Miss Gripe and the two Bow Street officers squeezed their way into the secret passage. Simon, who had left his geese in the stable yard, hesitated, but Miss Gripe said, come on, boy. Sorry, Mr. Gripe said, come on, boy. The more witnesses, the better, so he followed. Bonnie and Sylvia spent the time, while they waited for James's return, in artistically dirtying and untidying each other, rubbing dust and coal in their faces, rumpling their hair and making themselves look as dejected and orphanly as possible. James came back with a long face. You're to come to the up to the schoolroom, young ladies, at once. He led the way, and they followed in silence. The house bore traces everywhere of its new use as a school. On the crystal chandelier in the ballroom, ropes had been slung for climbing, and the billiard table had been exchanged for blackboards. The portraits of ancestors in the long gallery had been replaced by notice boards, and the gold leaf of ormolu tables were covered with chalk powder and ink stains. Even though they knew they had good friends close at hand, the children could not control a certain swelling and breathless feeling in the region of their midriffs as they approached the schoolroom door. James tapped on the door, and in response Miss Slycap's "Come in" opened it and stood aside to let the children through. A quick glance showed them that all the furniture had been removed and that the room was filled with desks. The more senior children from Mrs. Brisket's schools were sitting at them, with expressions varying from nervous excitement to petrifaction on their faces. Miss Slycap stood on a raised platform by a blackboard. She had a long wooden pointer in her hand. Miss Brisket was there too, sitting at the instructress's desk. She wore a stern and foreboding expression, but on Miss Slycap's face there was a look of triumph. "So," she said, a long, hissing exclamation. "So, you have returned. Come here." They advanced, slowly and trembling, until they stood below the platform. Miss Slycap were so tall that they had almost to lean back to look up at her. "But please take us back into your school, Miss Slycap," faltered Bonnie. "We're so cold and tired and hungry." Into Sylvia's mind came a sudden recollection of the grouse pies and apricots that they had eaten on the train. She bit her lip and tried to look sorrowful. Behind them, James quietly poked the fire, but no one noticed him. All eyes were on the returning truants. "Hungry," said Mrs. Slycap. "You'll be hungry still before I've done with you. Do you think you can run away, spend 2 months idling and playing on the moors, return when it suits you, and then expect to be given roast beef and pudding? You'll have no food for 3 days. Perhaps that will teach you something, and you shall both be beaten. And we'll see what a taste of the dungeons will do for your spirit. James, go and get the dungeon keys." "No, miss," said James firmly. "I obey some of your orders, but because I've got no alternative. But I'll help to put children in those dungeons. I can't and won't. It's not Christian." And he left the room, shutting the door sharply behind him. "I'll get the keys, Letitia," said Mrs. Brisket, rising ponderously. "You can be administrating chastisements meanwhile." Punishments. Miss Slycap came down from the platform. "Miss Green," she said, and her eyes were so glittering with fury that even Bonnie quailed. "Put out your hand." Bonnie took a step backwards. Miss Slycap followed her and raised the pointer menacingly. The children at the desk drew a tremulous breath, but just as the pointer came swishing down, the chimney-piece panel flew open, and Mr. Gripe, stepping out, seized hold of Miss Slycap's arm. For a moment she was utterly dumbfounded. Then, in wrath, she exclaimed, "Who are you, sir? Let me go at once. What are you doing in my house?" "In your house, ma'am. In your house. Don't you remember me, Miss Slycap?" said Mr. Gripe. "I was the attorney instructed by your distant relative, Sir Willoughby Green, to seek you out and offer you the..." the position of instructor to his daughter. You brought with you a testimonial from the Duchess of Kensington. Do you remember? Miss Slycap turned pale. And who gave you permission, woman? Suddenly thundered Mr. Gripe, to turn this house into a boarding school? Who said you could use these children with villainous cruelty, beat them, starve them, and lock them in dungeons? Oh, it's no use to protest. I've been behind that panel and heard every word you've uttered. It was only a joke, faltered Miss Slycap. I had no intentions of really shutting them in the dungeons. At this moment, Mrs. Brisket re-entered the room, holding a bunch of enormous rusty keys. We can't use the upper dungeons, Letitia, she began briskly, for Lucy and Emma are occupying them. I have brought the lower. Then she saw Mr. Gripe, and behind him the two Bow Street officers. Her jaw dropped, and she was stricken to silence. Only a joke indeed, said Mr. Gripe harshly. Mr. Cardigan, place these two females under arrest, if you please, until it is convenient to remove them to jail. You may as well avail yourself of the dungeon keys so obligingly put at your disposal. You can't do this. You've no right, shrieked the enraged Miss Slycap, struggling in the grip of Cardigan. I have papers signed by Sir Willoughby, empowering me to do as I please with this property in the event of his death, and appointing me guardian of the children. Papers signed by Sir Willoughby? Pish.
What's pish?
It's a swear word in Scotland, but it means rubbish in England. So you would not say that in Scotland, okay? Said Gripe scornfully. You may as well know, ma'am, that your accomplished Grimsaw, who is already in prison, has confessed to the whole plot. At this news, all the fight went out of Mrs. Brisket, and she allowed herself to be manacled by Spock, only muttering, Grimshaw's a fool, a paltry, whining fool. But Miss Slycap still gave battle. I tell you, she shouted, I saw Sir Willoughby before he departed, and he himself left me full powers. At this moment a heavy tread resounded along the passage, and they heard a voice exclaiming, What the devil's all this? Desks, blackboards, carpets taken up? Has my house been turned into a reformatory? The door burst open, and in marched Sir Willoughby Green. Behind him stood James, grinning for joy. Bonnie turned absolutely pale with incredulity, stood so for a moment, motionless and wide-eyed, then, uttering one cry, Papa! She flung herself into her father's arms. Well, Minx, have you missed us, eh? Have you been a good girl and minded your books? I can see you haven't, he said, surveying her lovingly. Rosy as a pippin and brown as a berry, I can see you've been out of doors all day long instead of sewing your sampler and learning your je ne sais quoi. And Sylvia too, eh, my word, what a change from the little white mouse we left here. Well, girls. Girls will be girls. But what's all this, ma'am? He continued, addressing Miss Slycap threateningly. What's all this hugger-mugger?
What's hugger-mugger?
Maybe what's just all this change? I never gave you permission to turn Willoughby Chase into a school. No, damn I didn't. Being my fourth cousin doesn't give you such rights as that. But, sir, interjected Mr. Gripe, who was at first silent with amazement, had now got his breath back. Sir Willoughby, this is joyful indeed. We had all supposed you drowned when the Thessaly sank. Sir Willoughby burst into a fit of laughter. Aye, so they told me at your office. We have been travelling close behind you, Mr. Gripe. I visited your place of business yesterday, learned you had just departed for Willoughby, and, since Lady Green was anxious to get back as soon as may be, and relieve the children's anxiety, we hired a special train and came post-haste after you. But were you not in the shipwreck then, Sir Willoughby? The reply to this question was lost in Bonnie's rapturous cry. Is Mamma here too? Is she? Why, yes, miss, and ettling to see you, I'll be bound. Before the words had left his mouth, Bonnie was out of the door. Sylvia, from a nice sense of delicacy, did not follow her cousin. She thought that Bonnie and her mother should be allowed those first few blissful moments of a reunion together. Sir Willoughby and Mr. Gripe had retired to a corner of the schoolroom, and Mr. Gripe was talking hard, while Sir Willoughby listened with his blue eyes bulging, occasionally exclaiming, "Why, damn! For sheer cool, calm, impertinent effrontery! Why, bless my soul!" Once he wheeled round to his niece and said, "Is it really true, Sylvia? Did Miss Slycap do these things?" "Yes, sir, indeed she did, said Sylvia. "Then hanging's too good for you, ma'am," he growled at Miss Slycap. "Have her taken to the dungeons, Gripe. When these two excellent fellows have breakfast, they can take her and the other harpy off to prison." "Oh, sir," said Sylvia. Well, Miss Puss, may I go with them to the dungeon, sir? I believe there are two children who have been put down there by Miss Slycap, and they will be so cold and unhappy and frightened." "Are there? By Joshua, we'll all go," said Sir Willoughby. Sylvia had never visited the dungeons at Willoughby Chase, and they were a dismal and frightening quarter, never entered by the present owner and his family, though in the days gone by they had been extensively employed by the ancestors of Sir Willoughby. Down dark, dank, weed-encrusted steps they trod, and along narrow, rock-hewn passages where the only sound besides the echo of their own footfalls was the drip of water. Sylvia shuddered when she remembered Miss Slycap's expressed intention of imprisoning herself and Bonnie down here. "Oh, do let us hasten," she implored. "Poor Lucy and Emma must have been nearly frozen with cold and fear." "Upon my soul," muttered Mr. Gripe, "this passes everything. Fancy putting children in a place like this." Miss Slycap and Miss Brisket trod along in the rear of their captors, silent and sullen, looking neither to the right nor to the left. The plight of Lucy and Emma was not quite so bad as it might have been. This was owing to the kind-hearted James, who, though he could not release them, had contrived to pass through their bars a number of warm blankets and a quantity of kindling and some tapers to enable them to light a fire, and he had also kept them supplied with food out of his own meagre rations. But they were cold and miserable enough, and their astonishment and joy at the sight of Sylvia was touching so to behold. Sylvia danced up and down with the bars with impatience while James found the right key, and then she hurried them off upstairs without waiting to see Miss Slycap locked in their place. Come quickly and get warm by the fire. Patten shall make you a posset. Oh no, I forget, Patten is probably not here yet, but I think I know how it is done." However, they had no more than reached the great hall when they were greeted with an ecstatic cry from Bonnie. "Sylvia! Emma! Lucy! Come and see Mamma! Oh, she is so different, so much better!" They went rather shyly into the salon, where Patten, who had been summoned by Simon at full gallop at one of the coach horses, bustled about in joyful tears and served everybody with cups of frothing hot chocolate. "Well," a gay voice exclaimed, "where's my second daughter?" And in swept someone whom Sylvia would hardly have recognised for the frail, languid Lady Green, so blooming, beautiful, and bright-eyed did she appear. She embraced Sylvia, cordially made welcome to the two poor prisoners, and declared, "Now I want to hear all your story, every word, from the very beginning. I am very proud of you both, and as for that Miss Slycap, cousin of your father's though she be, I hope she is sent to Botany Bay." But Aunt Sophie... it must have been a prison. "But Aunt Sophie," said Sylvia, "your tale must be so much more adventurous than ours. Were you not shipwrecked?" "Yes, indeed we were," said Lady Green, laughing, "and your uncle and I spent 6 very tedious days drifting in a rowing boat, our only fare being a monotonous choice of grapes or oranges, of which there happened to be a large crate in the dinghy, fortunately for us. We were then picked up by a small and most insanitary fishing boat, manned by a set of fellows as picturesque as they were unwashed, whom none of them spoke a word of English. They would carry us nowhere but to their home port, which turned out to be the Canary Islands. On this boat we received nothing to eat but sardines in olive oil, I'm surprised these shocks and privations did not carry me off, but Sir Willoughby maintains that they were the saving of me, for from the time of the shipwreck my health began to pick up. On reaching the Canaries, we determined to come home by the next mail ship, but they only visited these islands every 3 months or so, and one had just left. We had to wait a weary time, but the peace and the sunshine during our enforced stay completed my cure, as you see. Oh, how glad I am you came home and didn't go round the world, cried Bonnie. Sir Willoughby marched in, beaming. Well, he said. Has Madam Hen found her chicks, eh? But as for the state your house is in, my lady, I hardly dare to describe it to you. We shall have to have it completely redecorated. And what's to be done with all these poor orphans? Oh, Papa, said Bonnie, bursting with excitement. I have a plan for them. You have? Have you, hussy? What is it then? Don't you think Aunt Jane could come and live in the Dower House just across the park and run a school for them? Aunt Jane loves children. What? Aunt Jane run a school at her age? Aunt Jane is very independent, Bonnie said. She wouldn't want to feel she was living on charity, but she would have people to help her, kind people, and she could teach the girls beautiful embroidery. Lucy and Emma looked so wistful at the thought of this bliss that Sir Willoughby promised to consider it. A happy party sat down to dine in the great hall that night. Spock and Cardigan, the Bow Street officials, had already left to commit their prisoners to the nearest jail, and the ruffianly gang of servants kept on by Miss Slycarp had been summarily dismissed. Simon, riding about the countryside, had taken the news of Sir Willoughby's return to all the servants, Solly and Timon and John Groom and Mrs. Shubunkin, and they had all come hastening back. The orphans, still dazed at their good fortune, sat at a table of their own, eating roast turkey and kindly averting their gaze from the pale cheeks and red eyes of Diana Brisket, who, having been in a position to bully and hector as much as she pleased, was now reduced to the state where she had not a friend to stand by her. Mrs. Brisket had sold the school in Blackburn, so Diana had nowhere to go and was forced willy-nilly to stay with the orphans, where, it may be said in passing, wholesome discipline and the example of Aunt Jane's unselfish nature soon wrought an improvement in her character. Some of the parlour boarders and daughters of the nobility and gentry had been fetched away by their parents, such as lived near enough, and the rest were awaiting removal. Simon sat between Bonnie and Sylvia. Sir Willoughby gave him some very kindly looks. He had heard by now of Simon's brave part in rescuing the girls both from the wolves and from Mrs. Brisket's dreadful establishment, and of his help with Aunt Jane's illness. The money he had spent had been returned to him with interest. It looks as if we are going to have an adopted son as well as an adopted daughter, said Willoughby. Hey, my boy, what shall we do with you then? Put you through school? No, thank you, Sir Willoughby, said Simon gratefully but firmly. School wouldn't suit me at all. What then? Can't just run wild. I'm going to be a painter, Simon explained. Dr. Field said I showed great promise, and he told me I could stay with him and go to one of the famous London art schools. Oh, Simon, said Bonnie, dismayed. And leave Willoughby? I'll come back every holidays, he told her. Remember, we promised to go and see Mr. Wilderness. I want to paint a picture of Great Winsdale from the Dale. Oh, and 100 other places around here. Sensible lad, approved Sir Willoughby. Well, always remember, whenever you come back, there's a warm welcome for you at Willoughby Chase. Thank you, Sir Willoughby, said Simon, beaming. And now, if you excuse me, I think I ought to be returning to my cave. I want to see how my bees are getting on. Good night, Simon, cried Bonnie and Sylvia. We shall come and see you tomorrow. Bonnie yawned. It's long past these children's bedtime, said Sir Willoughby, and they were travelling all night. Off with you now. I dare say your mother will be up by and by to say good night to you in bed. Their own room had been hastily prepared for them, and they were glad to tumble between the fine silken sheets. And oh, Bonnie, called Sylvia, Have you seen the pretty dresses Pattern has been making for us? I've grown accustomed to boys' clothes, grumbled Bonnie. Oh, what nonsense, miss, said Pattern scoldingly, and ruined the effect by giving Bonnie a hug. There now, go to sleep, you blessed pair, and don't let either of you move a muscle till you're called. We've had quite enough to worry about today, with everything at 6s and 7s, and no servants to speak of, and hundreds of orphans to feed. Mind, you're not to speak a word till 8 o'clock. You're not even to dream. Dream? Murmured Bonnie sleepily. We can't help dreaming, Pattern. We've so much to dream about. The wolves, Miss Slycarp, and walking to London, and helping out poor Aunt Jane, and Mamma and Papa adrift in a boat full of oranges and grapes. Her voice trailed away into sleep. The light after light in the windows of the great houses was extinguished, until at length it stood dark and silent. And though the house had witnessed many strange scenes, wolf hunts and wine drink and weddings and wars, it is doubtful whether during its whole history any of its inmates had ever had such adventures as those of Sylvia and Bonnie Green. And that's it, the Wolves of Willoughby Chase. We're done. We're ready for an hour. Turn it off, Rachel.